Henning. I'm chair of the Environmental Studies Department here at Gonzaga, and I'm really happy that you're all here this evening. We have a great event. Before we get started on that, I have just a couple of items that I wanted to mention in terms of upcoming events here at Gonzaga. So we have a number of other lectures coming up. The first one I want to draw your attention to is on Thursday. For the students who are going to be on campus this week. This Thursday at 7 o'clock in the Peterson Auditorium is an event. It's co-sponsored by the Washington Division for Social Responsibility through Spokane, Health Equity Circle, which is a group of med students from WSU campus. We're all going to focus on climate change and environmental health. So I encourage you to come to that at 7 o'clock this Thursday in Peterson Auditorium. And then in addition to that, there's an event on March 4th on student activism here at Gonzaga. In particular, the Gonzaga Environmental Organization and Environmental Studies Department are hosting some students from Seattle University who were successful in getting their university to divest from fossil fuels. And so the divestment initiative here at Gonzaga has invited those Seattle U students to come over and share their experiences. That's on March 4th at 6 o'clock in the Peterson Auditorium as well. Those are both open to the public if you're interested in those events. And then I have a couple from Madeline. Who's going to come up.
Hi, so I just wanted to be aware of two involved on campus. One is the Gonzaga Environmental Organization, which is a group from campus that focuses on students. Another one is Plan My Future, and their goal is to have a plan every classroom by 2020. And I'm a part of a group called Students in the Litigation Program, and those students have a goal to integrate zero waste lifestyle into their principal and some of the time. And we just wanted to make an area to do that. Our peak this year is going to be 6
All right, so to our main event. I'd like to start off and before we introduce our speaker, to recognize the fact that we are, each of us here, historically come from somewhere. And on this land where we find ourselves today is the ancestral homeland of the people of the Spokane tribe. We should remember that and reflect on the fact that we are on another people's land, that we're lucky to have been invited here by that community to form a university. So our speaker tonight is Mike Peterson, and the idea for this event occurred to me when Mike casually mentioned one day that he used to be an Earth First activist, and I had no idea that we had a radical environmentalist in our midst. And I thought, what an interesting idea to have someone. I'm not going to try and resist this thing too much because I'm hoping in the course of this lecture that Mike is going to be sharing a lot of his transformation. But Mike Peterson has become sort of a central figure for decades in Spokane in leading what is now sort of our chief environmental organization, the Lands Council here in Spokane, and has been doing amazing work in our community for decades, and has learned how to collaborate with people who are loggers and who are ranchers. And so you wouldn't expect that of an Earth First radical environmentalist. Tree hugger. So I thought that would be a wonderful opportunity to hear about that transformation, hoping that both community members and also Gonzaga students can think about what it's like to have that sort of career where you figure out how to work across and among and within the divisions, given that we find ourselves in a world in which our divisions seem to be so tribal and so visceral that it's tantamount to sort of sacrilege to work with the other side. Mike Peterson gives us, I think, a vision for how we can do that without compromising our principles. So, without any further ado, I'm very happy to invite Mike Peterson from the Lands Council.
Thanks, Fran. Well, this is kind of a treat. I recognize some of you and a lot of students, of course, I've never seen. There's former board members and Rich from the Spokane Review. So all this is unofficial, off the record, right, Rich? Second, is there any FBI agents in the room? Okay, probably if you are, you wouldn't say. Well, I really appreciate Brian asking me to do this because it caused me to reflect back on something a friend said long ago. She said, Mike, you've changed. And then I thought, yeah, you haven't. So it's interesting how those things go along. It kind of started out, I grew up in Colorado, and one of the first things I think that inspired me and inspired a lot of our generation was this ad on TV, and it was a Indian canoeing down this waterway, and then he runs into all this trash and rubbish, and that was kind of an iconic ad. The ironic part of it, he was actually not a Native American, so that's kind of funny. But anyway, he's a famous actor from Ireland, I think. But it really got people thinking about what do we do about our environment? It's starting to get, people are throwing trash everywhere. We started having more and more problems with rivers catching on fire, that sort of thing. And so that was one of the early days. And then I grew up, as I said, in Colorado. And so one of my earliest sort of ecological projects was on the South Platte River, which flows through Denver. And I had a great biology teacher, Professor Bolin. And so we did a water quality test. We started way up in the headwaters and worked our way down and took samples, and then gosh, lo and behold, it got more polluted the closer you got to Denver. And so that kind of got me thinking environmentally when I was in high school back in the very early 70s. And then I was in the Navy, United States Navy. It's where I met my good friend Tim Coleman, who couldn't make it down tonight, but he's head of the Keller Range Conservation Group, and we have done a lot of work together environmentally for 45 years. Anyway, I was stationed in Tokyo for 2 years. And this is a little bit more recent picture of Tokyo, but it was kind of like that then, a 50-mile circle of human occupation, businesses, some great food, traffic jams, subways. And in the distance, though, there were mountains and amazing mountains, and Tim and I climbed mountains. But there was a weird thing when we got to the top of the mountains. There's piles of trash. People would bring up their soda pop and their sandwich wrap and just leave it at the top of the mountain. And so that was also inspiring in a way, because nobody wants to, at least in my mind, go to the top of a mountain and find that it's turned into a trash dump. But that's what I found there. And so that was kind of radicalized me in a bit. And I started reading Ed Abbey. And Edward Abbey is an amazing author. He wrote Desert Solitaire, but he also wrote a book, The Monkey Wrench Gang. And that was kind of the early firing up book that I think a lot of Earth First people who started out, the Dave Foremans, Mike Rosells of the world, the Hal Rose of the world, who's here in the audience tonight, were inspired by the actions of that book, which was people cutting down billboards and painting stripes on dams and doing things like that in an early effort to try to fight back against what they saw was environmental degradation. Well, when I was in college then, and I was going through school as an engineer, and which I have a master's in mechanical engineering, and lo and behold, Edward Abbey was coming to Fort Collins, and he was going to give a presentation. So I had just kind of started an Earth First group, and what better way to exploit Edward Abbey than to show up in front of his speech and in front of the building he was speaking in and have a little table and start recruiting people to join Earth First. And he stopped by and he goes, "Way to go. Thanks for taking advantage of me. I appreciate that, though." And he got it, because that was a classic Earth First thing. You just went and did what you thought was the right thing to do, and maybe your social graces weren't always perfect, but you got away with it most of the time. I met him later, a couple years later, at the 1987 Round River Rendezvous down in Arizona on the edge of the Grand Canyon, and we talked some more. And he was a pretty casual guy. You know, one of his famous quotes was, "Be a half-time activist But he was really a full-time writer and a pretty amazing thinker, I think, and one of the early sort of icons in my mind, at least. So what I'm going to do now is go through a few subject matters of what has affected me and what I've worked on over the years and how it's turned out. And I'm going to talk about wolves and cows, and then I'm going to talk about forests, I'm going to talk about water issues, and I'm going to talk about energy issues. So back in the day, we'd been doing some Earth First actions, and there was a call to action by a bunch of people to go out and stop the British Columbia aerial wolf kill. And this was back in the call went out in 87. And so a bunch of us, including Tim and Sue Coleman and some other friends I still have, went up in the middle of the winter in February we were going to stop the wolf kill, the aerial wolf kill, which is kind of audacious. This was all the way up near the Yukon in the Musqueam. And our plan was to just camp out, occupy the office up there, and basically make such a ruckus that things would stop. 3 women also decided they would parachute into the site, and it's possible some of you might remember that story. And the guy who kind of inspired us to go there had written an article in the Earth First Journal, Paul Watson, Greenpeace formerly, and then Sea Shepherds after he got tired of Greenpeace. And so it was a very inspirational article, which is really worth thinking about how a good writer can inspire people in a way that causes them to dive into action. And I think, to me, I've been on the receiving end of those amazing articles, and it has inspired me to do things like go up near the Yukon in February and camp outside. And it was cold. One night I remember I had 3 sleeping bags, and we were camped out on the ground, and it was about 25 below zero. And we did our thing, running around Fort St. John, Fort Nelson, protesting, holding signs on the side of the highway. And I remember this trucker drives by. He goes, "Hey, you coming back in June?" No, he said, "Are you going to save the mosquitoes?" So it's like, okay, wolves were not highly popular amongst some people down there, or up there. Well, lo and behold, though, and then we went down to Vancouver and hit the government buildings and protested and did some other things. And they actually were forced to stop the wolf kill. It got such bad publicity for them. So there was a story about it in the Earth First Journal, and felt pretty good about that. You know, there were probably a lot of reasons. Maybe they ran out of fuel, I don't know, but they did stop that aerial wolf kill. So here we are years later, and we have wolves in Washington. And a group of us went one day years and years ago, and we had kind of a weird band with a saxophone and a guitar, and Frank and Rusty and Tim and I, we had wolf masks on, and we're prancing around Spokane, and our banner said, "Washington wants wolves," and we were putting stickers everywhere, and we actually hung a banner out by that's now the Holiday Inn Express, and it stayed up for a month, which is kind of weird, and then some other activists took it down, and we got the banner back, I think. And we still have those wolf masks, and we trot them out every once in a while. Washington now has wolves, of course, and that has created a whole new set of issues because Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is now aerially killing wolves, and they're doing it right near our homes, right up in the Kettle Range, and wherever they've seen packs that are eating cows. But the ranchers, for their part, have faced a whole new phenomenon. They used to just turn their cows out there in May, up in the Kettle Range, and the cows would wander up and eat the grass as the season went on, and then they'd wander out and the ranchers wouldn't get them till October. Well, imagine that now when there's wolves up there. You can't operate the same way. And so the next step in things on the BC wolf kill is also trying to shoot some more wolves. So some things you accomplish for a while, and then some things circle back on you again. So I work at the Lands Council with Chris Bachman on this wolf issue, and in fact, that seems like that's all we worked on today. It was pretty amazing. Our idea at the Lands Council, and it's kind of a collaborative idea, is to actually find lower elevation, better pasture, and keep the cows together so they can be defended against wolves. Now, the ranchers don't like to be told what to do, but I'll tell you the agencies love the idea because Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is getting beat up, especially on the west side, about killing wolves. The Forest Service, who manages the allotments, has just kind of let things happen, but they see some advantages, and their supervisor, Rodney Spolin, said, yeah, we need to be more deliberate about how we think about pasture for cattle. Well, along with this, back in the day, we had this kind of chant, cattle free by 93. Sometimes you have a campaign and it doesn't really work out. There's still cows on many, many allotments, and it's well past 1993. And I found this picture. I thought that was hilarious. You might have heard of Cliven Bundy. He's a Bundy clan, and he's got this, quite frankly, it's one of the trashiest ranches I've ever seen. It's down there on the Virgin River, kind of near Mesquite, Nevada. It's on the way to Gold Butte National Monument. And, you know, just junk laying all over, and it's pretty bad. Well, he had been grazing his cattle for years, not paying for his grazing allotment, even though it was on federal land, has gone to court, has been told he has to remove them, and then his sons were the ones who took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge and caused a bunch of ruckus up there. So he's kind of an anti-government guy, you would say, but even him was saying no move by 92. That's what he thought the BLM policy was. No move by 92, cattle free by 93. Well, that never came to happen, and the BLM actually never had that policy. The BLM has been extremely accommodating toward cattle ranching, as we know. So our concept, as I mentioned, is to have open up the old meadows, because the Colville National Forest, when you look at old aerial photos, has really thickened up over the years. Trees have gotten more dense, meadows have been encroached upon. And we think if it was done carefully and you could keep all the cows more bunched up, they're not going to have as many problems with the wolves. And then do that kind of near the roaded lands that have already been managed, and leave the really high open, high elevation areas so the cows don't go up there, because that's really where we want to have all the wildlife, and that's where we want to not be having cow manure piles around trails and around water and springs and things like that. So, ask me in a year how this goes, and we'll see. But it's a very interesting campaign in my mind. So, one of the things I've worked on since the mid-'80s is logging, clear-cut logging, road building, those sort of things, and on public lands, on national forests. And I got to tell you, when I bought land up with Tim and Sue Coleman, and we lived out in the woods, we were really surprised. We bought land in the early 80s, and then we'd go up there, and then we'd see clear cuts appearing overnight, it seemed like. And we'd see creeks that were just flowing muddy, and a lot of damage, a lot of stumps, and just this is a clear cut, in that left picture. That's a pretty large clear cut. That's a few thousand acres of clear cut. That's in the Coeur d'Alene Basin. And so we thought, well, how are we going to stop this? This is having impacts. It helped start the Lands Council. Dr. John Osborne and Barry Rosenberg, some of the people who started it, were very offended by all the massive clear cutting and road building and damage. If there was no impacts, that'd be one thing, but there was a lot of damage from this. And so we have the whole saga of the Coeur d'Alene Basin, the South Fork, sort of having the mining legacy where polluted water was coming down. The North Fork having a lot of excess runoff from logging, road building, that sort of thing. And you can see here some pictures of roads that have, literally degraded, and you may have all seen that, and when it floods, you have that kind of problem. And we had a pretty cynical view. Remember, this is like the late 80s. Pretty cynical view of the Forest Service, and so you'd make posters like, oh, the Forest Service is just trying to scam everybody, and they'd have a buffer strip, the beauty strip, and then beyond that would be the clear cuts. And since we didn't have drones in those days, you couldn't really fly up the mountain and see what was going on everywhere. we had a few overflights that showed us what that was like. So what Earth First did was we were just the macho people. I see Hal smiling over there. So we're the radical environmentalists, and we were going to change the world, and we're going to stop this bad logging. And we did things, we protested, we had demos, there was litigation. We did a tree sit. We did a national tree sit back in I think that was 87. And we had one on the Colville, and it was at the edge of a logging operation, and Tim Coleman was up in the tree, and I was guarding the base of it. And so we hung out and for a couple days, and then it ran its course. They said, well, you can either leave or you're going to jail, and we didn't want to go to jail that day, so we left. But there was these protests all around the country about logging, stop the destruction. Freddie, that's the Forest Service, kind of nickname for the Forest Service. And so I would have to say we had some great artists in Earth First who were very skilled at putting together a poster in an afternoon, and then we'd stick them up everywhere. And we had annual Round River Rendezvous gatherings. And so we had the one I mentioned in 1987, was down in Arizona. And 1988, Tim and Sue and I and a couple other friends who didn't want their names mentioned thought we could pull one off in the Colville National Forest, and we did. We pulled it off, and we did it kind of near the little town of Malo up in the mountains. And that was maybe one of we had all the original founders of Earth First, the Dave Foremans of the world, Mike Rosells, a lot of pretty high-level people there from the Earth First movement. We had a guy who was teaching a, quote, diesel mechanics course, which is how to disassemble a diesel. Turned out he was an FBI agent. So the FBI was getting interested because there was monkey wrenching alleged connecting it to Earth First. So yeah, imagine FBI agent. And I didn't attend that course, which I'm sort of happy about actually. So they did a big story in I think the Spokane Review about the Earth First coming out of the shadows and talked about our Round River Rendezvous. Now what we did after the rendezvous was we went over to the Okanagan National Forest where they were also clear cutting, and that's kind of Omak up toward the Methow. And we occupied the Okanagan National Forest office, and there was like 100 of us, and 26 of us got arrested and spent a day or so in jail till they released us. And so this is my true confessions tonight, folks, you know. But those things, I think, helped. They set a little national tone, and some people probably never heard of it. And so the idea was you take this direct action, you put your body on the line, and see if you could make enough publicity, maybe get some politicians interested in changing things with the legislation, have attorneys get involved at some point. To me, it was a little bit of a lesson on activism that I think is kind of worth sharing. If an issue is kind of brand new and you need to call attention to it, writing a letter to your congressman probably won't get you there. Showing up with 4 people at a protest probably won't get you there. Blowing something up probably won't get you there. But if you do something like a very organized, show up with 1,000 people at a hearing, for example, show up and blockade a logging road, that sort of thing, it kind of gets the publicity. It has the reporters maybe get interested so it doesn't just fall as a column on page 12 or 100 or whatever. And so lots of efforts at trying to change the public perception, inform folks about what was going on out in the woods. And even the Sierra Club, the Sierra Club kind of takes on certain issues as they get pressure to take on issues. And so there was a campaign to take on the Sierra Club and have them really adopt logging as a major issue. And they did at some point. And they're a big national organization. So in a way, there's the idea of, helping push an organization or another group to doing something that maybe you don't quite have enough strength yourself to do. So that was the arrest I mentioned in the Washington demo. And that just blew my record. That's why I'm probably never running for governor. But when you do something like that with your passion in your heart, I think it's worth it. I think there's always a place for putting your body on the line a bit. If it's the right thing, there's also a place for analyzing whether it's going to be the right thing and whether that's a good tactic or a tactic that's been used too many times or a tactic for something that already has important power players working on the issue that you're just getting in their way. So there's an old photo of me with my Earth First t-shirt, and I had a slightly longer hair in those days. But what's really cool is the woman on the left side is my mother. So she was one of the inspirations, and we did a demo at the Colville office, and it was just to kind of blockade the demo, or blockade the office for a while. We had no intention of getting arrested, and we didn't. What was really cool is we had their public relations person come out. Her name was Cindy, and she ended up becoming a board member of some of our groups. So I think that's pretty cool. And what that also told me, though, there were allies within the Forest Service. There were wildlife biologists. There were, soil and fisher people who didn't necessarily like all this clear cutting either. And so getting a handle on why was all this crazy clear cutting going on and what could we do that would be effective, a protest at the office of the Forest Service in Colville. Got some media. That was pretty good. The one picture I couldn't find, though, and it was an interesting lesson for me, this woman had on this just crazy mask and costume, and guess who ended up on the front page of the paper? And so it's almost like if you're going to do a direct action kind of demo, you almost want to, I think, dress up a little bit and look like everyday people instead of kind of looking like a freak. So things you learn, but I probably look like kind of a freak there with my long hair and my fist, You learn. So a lot of things were going on. There was a place in Idaho called Cove Mallard, and it was a roadless area they were trying to build a road into, and they were, and I went up there for a while, and the idea was construct these road blockades and just try to shut down the logging. And a lot of people got arrested, and they would a human would get into that blockade that would be very difficult to remove. So you might shut them down for a day or two. And if you kept doing that, just like with tree sits, Julia Butterfly kind of is a classic woman who sat in a tree for over a month, I think. And those things got national news and were symbolic. And they also kind of messed up the logging operations. And I'll talk in a few more minutes about Redwood Summer, about why that was effective down there. So different road blockade types things. So long about 1990, we had a Round River rendezvous down in New Mexico, I think. And there was a call to go to Redwood Summer. And this was land, this was private land, Pacific Lumber land. And those Pacific Lumber had been doing an okay job for quite a few years, actually. They got bought out by this guy, Charles Hurwitz. And Charles Hurwitz also bought Kaiser. And he's like one of the early, let me buy a company and just gut it of its resources. I forget what they call them, Bart, but those kind of people are still up there, I think, running hedge funds now. So he was not a nice guy. He was in it for the money. And this was an amazing stand of trees, several stands of trees, big old growth redwood trees. And I eventually went in there. I spent about 7 weeks in there, camping out, running around. And I'll tell you, to see one of those huge redwood trees falls, you just couldn't believe it. It was so, knowing it was hundreds of years old, 8 feet across, that sort of thing. It was just, kind of made you pretty sick, actually. So, Redwood Summer, it's where the 90s began. Judy Berry was one of the kind of early instigators and a great hero, and some of you may recall it was never found out who did it for sure, whether it was Tim Ministry or the FBI, but her car was bombed. And she suffered injuries, and I think she passed away in the 90s, maybe partly because of the injuries, I'm not sure about that, but she was a real inspiration. And she also brought an interesting thing, because Earth First to that point seemed like it was a bunch of, backwoods people who weren't very urban, and Judy had already worked with labor unions and had worked with, a lot of workers out in the woods. So I think she brought that flavor to it in a lot of ways that was just wonderful, because she even started talking with the Kaiser workers and stuff like that, who were kind of getting messed around by Horowitz's basic, almost thievery. So she was a great activist. So a whole summer of actions was planned. And there was this, kind of, let's compare it to Mississippi summer, where there was a lot of work on civil rights movement. So trying to connect in with other movements and forward the idea that people could come from anywhere and show up. So I had been working at the Ferry County Co-op up in Republic, and I was a co-manager, but I wasn't a very good one because I kept taking time off. And I was down to like 2 days a week, and then I had to take the summer off. So Sue Coleman was manager, but it was kind of okay with her. But I ended up going down to Redwood Summer, and there was kind of a big base camp where all the kind of hippies were. And then there was a group of us that decided we were just going to run around in the woods every night, and then, this was near Arcata, and camp on the beach during the day. And we had a challenging time. We had hardly any money, so we'd go into restaurants and like get water and maybe French fries, and then when people left their yummy food on the table, we'd eat it. There may have been some dumpster diving. We operated very cheaply. And so our plan was to go out into the woods at night and learn the layout. And this area was, I want to say 20 miles by 20 miles, but maybe not quite that big. Roads kind of laced throughout it. It had a lot of topography, many old, groves of giant trees, little creeks, that sort of thing. And our whole idea was to lead other people, because after a while we were like trip guides for Redwood Summer. So we'd lead other people in. And so one day we had a whole bunch of people, I think 100 people, who wanted to get arrested. And so we led them into these groves of trees. And I remember we camped out overnight, and we'd been kind of putting up those same kind of blockades during the night, so it'd slow the logging down. And the guys would, and so we have all these campers. Well, here comes some logging truck, and it's on a road above us, and everyone's going, shh, turn your lights out. And a couple of friends of mine are just crashing through the woods, trying to like get away. And it's like, shh, they won't see you. Just settle down, So we marched into the grove the next day, and it was just a scene of incredible chaos. People were hugging around trees. There were cops, people deputized, forest workers deputized, police running after everybody, and people willingly getting arrested, but people wanting to get away. And so I managed to survive that day without getting arrested, but I calculated that I walked 35 miles that day, because we had a rendezvous point to get picked up so we could go sleep. And so only, I think, 3 of us made it out to the rendezvous point. But it was just amazing. And I even had a map that I would show people. We'd make Xerox copies of all the where the redwood stands were, and where the groves were, and where the logging equipment, which we encourage everyone to stay away from the logging equipment. Don't mess with stuff. You just put people in danger. It's not cool. And then all the topography of the area. So that was, Redwood Summer was one heck of a time. I think that fall, my wife at the time wanted to divorce me, and so we did eventually. But I had not been very responsible probably. So slightly after that was, I started volunteering for the Lands Council. They, at the time, were called the Inland Empire Public Lands Council. And Barry Rosenberg and John Osborne, you know, they were right there. John Osborne would write this magazine, Transitions, and Forest Health Hoax, and we became the group who challenged, I think, the most timber sales in the country for a couple of years. We wrote timber sale appeals, and our ex-board member was involved with that at the same time. Thank you, Jeff. And it made a difference, and it didn't make any friends though, but it made a difference that we dropped the logging by 75–80% on the Colville National Forest and on the other forests we worked on. But what I think it did, and this is just my speculation, I think it opened the door to collaboration in a way, because I think you can collaborate, and you should collaborate whenever you possibly can, but I don't think you can do it from a position of complete weakness where you don't have a seat at the table. I think you've got to build up some cachet, and you could do it through politics or legislation or whatever, but we had done it through challenging timber sales. And so that kind of was our bread and butter for a while. We challenged a lot of timber sales. One time I went down, President Clinton actually went down to Portland after he'd been elected and said, I'm going to solve the timber problem in the Northwest, the spotted owl issue. And so I was down there with a bunch of people, and the Northwest Forest Plan was at issue there. It was drastically going to reduce the logging, but it was going to allow some logging. But I had a real interesting experience that I think also served to change my mind. At the Portland office is a regional Forest Service office, and that's where all of our appeals would go to. You know, an appeal is just a written challenge of you didn't follow the laws, you broke the National Environmental Policy Act or the Clean Water Act or whatever. Here's why this project should be stopped. So we'd go down there, and I think Tim was with me, and we're chatting with these totally friendly people. They're appeal reviewing officers. They were people who looked at appeals, and they're going, God, you seem like great people. And he says, let me read you this guy's, you know, and it was an appeal I had written, and it was all full of rhetoric, like, you guys are destroying the earth, and, you know, and it was one of those learning moments, I think, where you realize that, you know, I'm not communicating very well with these people. I might win some appeals, but I'm not winning any friends. And on the surface, we should have been friends. And so to me, that was really an important step of sort of transforming my thinking about how I interacted with other people. And so thinking about tactics, you know, we had demonstrations, blockades. Some people did monkey wrenching. There was art and theater, occupations, letter writing, legislation, litigation, and then collaboration. And so I think it depends on where you're at in the campaign of what tactics you're going to use and be effective at it. And so in the past about 15 years, I have really been convinced that the tactics of confrontation on many issues are not as effective as working together with people and finding common ground and finding solutions. And so that's where I've come to do some things. And I think one of the people that I met again was David Brower, and he was an amazing person too. He fought dams in the Colorado River. He got very engaged in the forest battles. He left the Sierra Club because they were too mellow for him, and he started Friends of the Earth. I happened to run into him, and this was a political moment. We were all in town in Des Moines, Iowa for the primaries for the I think it was the 92 presidential election. And so we sat down, and I had just helped start this group called the National Forest Protection Alliance, and he was there to talk with politicians, and we had a nice lunch and glass of wine and all that stuff. And he was so wise, and I think he had slightly mellowed too by that time and was thinking of more, let's be tactical and let's be smart about how we do things. But I'll tell you, in the old days, when they were going to either build a dam or not, there was limited opportunities to stop that dam. And I want to appreciate that he was able to stop dams that would have been built right in the middle of Grand Canyon. So zero cut was what the Lands Council got into in the last part of the 90s, and many other groups. And we formed the National Forest Protection Alliance. I was the chair of that for most of the time it was in existence. We have Representative Cynthia McKinney, who introduced legislation, which at one point got, I think, almost 100 co-sponsors in the House. It would have ended commercial logging on public lands. We thought that would, stop all this clear cutting. Sierra Club kind of got behind it, but they never put any actual work into it. Years later, I just saw this article last year, and this guy who runs part of another organization, the Alliance for Wild Rockies, who has their own separate bill, but they're very critical of zero cut, had a story, Campaign of Illusions, where the zero cut movement to save the national forest went wrong. And part of it was the zero cut movement had a goal that was unrealistic. It sounded good, and yet it didn't include people who worked in the industry, people who lived in rural communities. It didn't have any pathway forward. So it's kind of like when you read a book and most of the book tells you the problem in the world, and then the last page tells you the utopian dream, but there's never any connection between those two parts of the book. Maybe the zero cut movement was a little bit like that. So we endorsed it in the 90s, and then we started switching gears. And check my time here. So now we work in 4 different forest collaborations. So why is that? How did that happen? Does that make any sense? Are we selling out? Are we gaining things? And I'll talk about that for a few minutes. Tim Coleman and I, Tim with the Keller Range Conservation Group, and myself met with Dwayne Vaughan, who owns Vaughan Brothers Timber. And he said, so what if we worked on some sort of a deal where you guys got 100,000 acres of wilderness, we got maybe, I think he said 4,000 acres a year to log, we're into small diameter trees, we won't cut old growth. And that really started the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, was thinking, maybe we could all live with this. Because there was a lot of acres out there that had been logged over in the 60s, 70s, 80s that had those small trees, which were kind of unnatural. They just planted new fir usually. And that might have been, and they already had a road system. And if these guys are willing to support no new roads, wilderness, not logging old growth, that might be worth talking about. And so that's what's happened over the last 17 years now, is those discussions with not only Vaughan Brothers, but Idaho Forest Group, Stimson a little bit, and Boise a little bit. Some companies still don't like the idea of collaborating with environmentalists, and certainly some environmentalists don't like the idea of collaborating with timber companies. So where have we gotten after 17 years? Not 1 acre wilderness has been protected on the Colville National Forest, although we are in discussions right now that I think are the most serious they've been. Old growth logging has completely stopped on the Colville National Forest and the Idaho Panhandle National Forest. There's been no entry into roadless areas, which was a big beef of ours, that they kept chopping away into roadless areas. The roads are, any new road building, the roads are shut down afterwards, or you close down an equal number of roads. So we've got a pretty good policy. We have what we call a blueprint. And overall, I've talked with people around the country, and they're still fighting old growth sales, and they're still fighting entry into roadless areas. And then some other groups manage to occasionally get wilderness, and that's pretty cool. We almost got some in North Idaho, and then there was an unfortunate countywide vote, which just kind of put it on hold for a while. So in my mind, it is kind of a compromise. They're logging, they're sending trees to their mill, they're smaller trees, but they're supporting staying out of old growth, staying out of roadless areas, and protecting new wilderness. So everyone can have an opinion on whether that's a good thing. To me, that has made a huge difference in our region, and the streams are getting clear, and the big trees are growing. And quite frankly, I think sometimes we do need to thin out these unnaturally thick stands that have just sat there. We put out fires, the trees keep growing. We planted those trees, way overplanted them. So I'm going to talk briefly about water, because I can see I'm starting to babble too long. People are sleeping in the back row. I mentioned the Coeur d'Alene Basin was a big thing, water issues, the Silver Valley mining, which continues to threaten to send metals from the bottom of Lake Coeur d'Alene up into our water columns here. And it has been a mess. It's been a health mess. The Lands Council started a Get the Lead Out program, where we helped a lot of people in the Silver Valley, but everywhere, learn about lead dangers, and lead is a very dangerous thing for young children. We have fought over that for a long time, and one of our former directors, Mark Solomon, even now is at the University of Idaho trying to figure out how to get momentum to scientifically address the problem that there's still this huge amount of lead and other contaminants at the bottom of the lake, that as soon as that lake starts acting like a regular lake and having some growth in it, that could turn over and end up going in the Spokane River. So along with, and Doug's going to like this part, along with the, fighting issues like that on water, we've always, myself, been pretty interested in recycling, and there's a bill about plastic recycling right now in the State House. Well, back in 1990, and I'll just say we, I was one of those people, I won't name the other people, but we came up with this idea that we thought the Spokesman Review should start recycling their paper. And we'd asked them before nicely, but they had never responded to us. Because they actually make paper at Inland Empire Paper, and then back in those days, the paper just didn't get recycled. So we decided we would declare a recycling party. And we sent out some flyers around, and we were going to have a party at the Spokesman Review on Earth Day. Bring all your newspapers. They're going to start recycling. Kind of like positive affirmation, right? Wow, they're going to do a good thing. That's so cool. Let's bring our newspapers over and celebrate with them. Well, this was so beautiful in the Spokesman Review. 4 days before Earth Day, to come out with this newspaper recycling party rejected as hoax. Fair enough. It was a hoax. I could say I'm the first fake news or something, But we went ahead and we had called all the TV stations, and most of the TV stations, except the one owned by Spokesman Review, showed up. And it was a big story. Oh, look, they're pressuring the Spokesman Review to do this recycling party. And so it got on TV, and we dumped off these newspapers we'd got from Earthworks, and it was pretty fun. What was really cool, though, is that 2 weeks after the recycling party, the Spokesman Review declares they are indeed going to start recycling newsprint. And they had looked at all the numbers, and it looked like it was going to pencil out for them. And so now we have recycling of newspapers. And we also have PCBs. So this is one of the things where you have unintended consequences. And it turns out all the inks, the colored ones, but also the black ones, have PCBs in them, and they're inadvertently created when they make that ink. PCBs can form, it's not natural, it's a highly high temperature chlorine process can form PCBs, which are there's 209 types, but the highest number ones are kind of like dioxins. They're pretty nasty, and we think maybe the lower number ones aren't quite as nasty. So there you go. You think you've just saved the world by recycling paper, and all of a sudden you've got PCBs. And so the Lands Council is very proud, and we work with Doug here and many other groups, dischargers, etc., on the Spokane River Regional Toxics Task Force. And I think it's an innovative body, it's a collaborative body, and it is like leading the nation in trying to deal with inadvertent PCBs. We're trying to pressure the EPA to change their standards under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And the state supports us, and all the dischargers help support it. And we are making some progress on identifying where the worst sources of PCBs are. And some are legacy PCBs from the old transformer, but some are new ones. If you're all wearing yellow or using yellow paint, that sort of thing, that's a certain type of PCB that shows up, and it's very easy to get that into our rivers and stormwater and waste streams. Other colors, blue, have their own different pathway, and so there's addressing this inadvertent PC problem, certainly a lot deeper than holding a recycling party, but it's really important stuff, and it's pretty cool to be part of that. For our role at the Lands Council, one of the things we do is we found out through some research that there's certain types of fungi that can break down PCBs. And so we've been working first with the city and then with the Toxics Task Force and North Central High School, who has the best high school lab in the state, to actually develop and test fungi that will break down PCBs. So I think that's such a super cool project. And our first round showed that it had broken down these really complex, high number PCBs that had a lot of chlorine atoms on it, but it broke them down into simpler ones. And so we want to try it for longer to see if it will break them down all the way. So that's kind of almost like karma. You got to keep working on stuff that you helped screw up in the first place, right? So my last topic is energy and climate change. And I appreciate Brian is working very hard on the clean energy bills, not only in the city, but also at the state level. And we've got to do something. Laura has taken on, coal and oil trains, that sort of thing. And people are activists in this room who are working on this issue. So I'm just going to talk about my tiny role in it. So my first demo I ever went to, and this is when I was in junior high school, was out at Rocky Flats, Colorado, where they made plutonium triggers for the atom bombs. And it was a protest out there, and my sister Susan had told me about it. So that was my first demo, and that was like in '67 or something like that. There's still a legacy. We had one of the rendezvous I mentioned near the Grand Canyon. Well, the action after the rendezvous, and there always is an action, was to occupy this uranium mine site. And shut it down for the day. We thought it was outrageous that they're mining uranium, which could potentially contaminate the Colorado River right on the edge of the Grand Canyon. And so a bunch of us went out there. I got arrested. Spent 4 days in Flagstaff jail with about 20 other people, and got to, really form some bonds with people and think about what it means. I think we were kind of stupid looking back on it. We were crawling around these tailings piles. So I don't know how safe that was, but I don't glow in the dark, so hopefully that's all right. That issue, they actually then had a 20-year moratorium on mining and any new mining claims in the Grand Canyon. That's coming up in a few years, and they, in the courts, they're already mostly ruling on the side of the uranium mining companies. And so that battle is not over yet. And uranium, of course, is used in nuclear reactors. And as people strive to deal with climate change issues, some people, including the Mothers for Nuclear, think that nuclear power is a solution. And the thing about nuclear power, it's nice, the whale kind of floating in front of the ocean. It works really good most of the time. And the challenge is it doesn't work too well when you're mining the stuff. There's contamination all around us here from all the Dawn mine and some Midnight mine, some of the other mines, which has still never been cleaned up. There's contamination at Hanford from all the nuclear research and weapons that were made down there. We haven't figured out the state of Nevada is suing the federal government over taking mining waste to Nevada, even on this year. And so we haven't figured out the waste part, we haven't figured out the mining part, and then there's a kind of Russian roulette part of they really work great most of the time until a few of them have had a meltdown though. We've heard of 3 Mile, we've heard of Chernobyl, we've heard of the one in Japan, of course. So it's a dilemma. So how do we care about climate change and we reject something like nuclear power, or we have unrealistic goals about getting off of fossil fuel power? Well, we got to work together on this. That's the way I look at it. This poll is, you could maybe ask a lot of people about what moves them to care about anything, and 59% to save money, to make my home more comfortable, to make my home healthier. And so a lot about me when they do polls on people. And so we think about how we're going to transform our economy in an intelligent and timely way so we can get off fossil fuels, which most of us at least believe is causing some climate change problems. It seems to show up more and more every year. How do we do that effectively? Well, I just want to salute a young woman who's 16, Greta Thunberg. She's from Sweden, and she's been taking a day off of school just to protest about the lack of action on climate change, and it's gathering momentum around Europe. Anyway, I haven't heard it starting here in the United States. But that's kind of inspiring that, it's not even the next generation, it's like 2 generations later than me, there's people who are willing to stand up and do their thing. And she just had a back and forth with the Prime Minister of Britain, where the Prime Minister said, well, you should be in school. And she came back and said, well, you should be doing something about climate change that you haven't done for 30 years. So, that's kind of the tactic of the moment, because I don't think, we're quite getting to climate change solutions by just, writing letters. We can't seem to get a Green New Deal going. Our president doesn't believe in it. So always look at the right tactics to use at the right time, I would just say. So I'm going to kind of end it there. I did want to say this is a picture of a raft trip I took 2 years ago on the Snake River. And all the, these are all old Earth firsters, and literally old. And so it's kind of fun to see what people have done over the years. Tim Coleman runs the Kettle Range Conservation Group. Mitch Friedman runs Conservation Northwest. People run the Center for Biological Diversity. Some have become leaders. A lot of them have left the movement. We like to just sit on plastic boats and drink beer now, though. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much, and you can ask questions if you want.
We've got some good time, so thank you, Mike. That was fantastic. Let's see, so I'd love to start with some students first before we get to community members, if that's okay. So I think that's like students have a question for Peterson.
They're shy. Oh, there you go.
Just to quickly repeat the question, so tell me if I get it right. So, Green New Deal.
All right.
How do we fix that?
Well, something I think people are overlooking a little bit with the Green New Deal is that it's going to take a huge investment of money. I think we all agree to that. Certain people think the government's going to pay for it all, but I don't think that has to be the case. There's a ton of money out there in funds and investment funds, trillions of dollars literally, that people are going to invest in something. They're sitting on it right now. As energy prices have dropped for renewables, as we find solutions to battery storage, I think those are going to become big investments. And so maybe you give people incentives, but there is a ton of private money out there, and I think you got to match that. I don't think you can have the government pay for it all. It's got to come from industry too. And I think if you work it right, those people, there's capital investment firms right now wanting to invest their money in renewable energy on a large scale.
So, but our representative doesn't see much. Drafting whole paradigms that look different than how we do. So how's
Yeah. The question is basically, you have major employers like the Vaughan brothers who support wilderness, the ski area owners, but the commissioners have always been really opposed to wilderness. So I met with them last week, and I went with them about a month ago, and with Catherine Morris Rogers' aide, Mike Polson, and we're starting to talk about how do we overcome the barriers that commissioners have, not only that the commissioners have, but what their, let's face it, conservative constituents have about wilderness. And there's 4 things that really go on. How do you keep the trails open? Because trees blow across trails, and in wilderness, you're supposedly not going to use chainsaws. Can you fight fires? How do you put out fires that we don't want them to, if they're upwind of our town, we don't want them to burn our town down? How do you deal with mineral rights? And then how do you keep the ranchers whole? And so finding the right language and solutions for those, and there are solutions to those. The mineral rights thing, if they have a claim, that's long established in the wilderness bill, you can go, use it. You have reasonable access to it. The grazing thing, well established, you can use every tool, including if you used a motor vehicle, you can still use that in wilderness areas. Keeping the trails open is actually one of the harder ones, because what do you have, a chainsaw weekend every year? There has been precedent in some areas where chainsaws have been used to open trails after blowdowns. And so that's an interesting one. And then fighting fires in wilderness is not only allowed, but so is doing prescribed fires. So I think in the case of one particular roadless area that's just upwind of a couple towns, we want to have a fire plan, and that would be called for in the legislation to make sure that that town has some protection from wildfire. So there's solutions. We're having some conversations that I find very interesting right now about that.
let's say a few words about the oil phase, which is the most troublesome.
Yeah, and thanks, Bart. That's a great question. I kind of feel like the collaborative work we're doing is trying to bridge that interface as much as any effort. And when you sit down with folks around a table for 15 years, you start getting a sense of they feel like they're losing everything, and the cities just are getting more and more power. And that's why when we solved, or at least on the Colville, I think we solved the problem of getting trees. No mills have shut down there for years now. Getting trees to the mill, that helps create that dialogue. The ranchers and the wolf thing is very challenging, and we're still working on that. You know, expanding pastures, who knows if that's going to work. But having those conversations, I actually have more conversations with rural county commissioners than I do with Spokane County commissioners. And I think that's what we should all be doing as much as possible, is having those conversations. And it's face-to-face, and not just one conversation, but, you know, monthly conversations. I don't know the answer to that question, actually. Maybe they ship it over here and put it in our harbors. No, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, that is the most perplexing question. I mean, people come out with articles every week about how do we communicate better about climate change issues. A story I read on the radio show today was, we call it aliens. Everyone would be up in arms about aliens, and so they take action immediately. So how do we do that on kind of a slow emergency is a great question. I think part of it is we are going to keep getting buffeted by worse and worse weather and storms. And I think that's already changing the discussion in a way. And so I'm afraid humans maybe wait till there's more of a disaster before they really take action. I'm not totally hopeful that we're all going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, okay, let's all work together and put our capital together and do that. I think it's going to take a little more pain, unfortunately. And it hurts the poorest people in the world, the people least able to defend themselves. So it's very unfortunate. Thank you for that. Well, I gave the example of Greta, the young woman who, she as an individual started a campaign. I think any individual is also capable of starting a campaign. And by all accounts, she's kind of a shy, everyday person who just decided one morning, I'm going to do something really different. People tend to go in groups. That's the way human nature is. But I'll tell you, sometimes you got to take over a group. Sometimes you got to start your own group. And I think Earth First did that in a way. I mean, everyone started little Earth First groups all over the country. And sometimes it was one person. So I think it could be one person writing passionately on their computer and sending it out over the internet that convinces people. Or it could be the power of thousands of people coming together at a hearing on an oil facility, or coming together to demand something. I was at the demo yesterday, I don't know if any of the rest, some of you were, I know, was with you, about building the wall versus doing something with climate change. And I think people who show up for those sort of things, if 10,000 people would have shown up in every city, that would have changed some things, I think. So it's a combination. If you're a great writer, go for it. If you're a great activist with a great idea, you don't need to have a group. And everyone's got their own social level that they're comfortable with.
An example of starting a group 2 years ago, local Spokane folks started a chapter of the International Climate Organization 350. And so over the last 2 years, we've been looking for ways to do collective action around the community and had some pretty good success. And so if you're interested in the climate issue and you're interested in local collective direct climate action, you can join our group 350 Spokane just by going to that website and having your email address. And it's been a pretty good vehicle for focusing narrowly on climate change. One of the things I've noticed from Mike and I collaboration is that you're able to focus on timber and water and wolves, and we're able to focus, just laser on climate issues. And that's nice to be able to have groups in town that can complement each other well and build on the work that's being done for decades in town. So I'd encourage folks, and I'd also remind you of one of the events. It occurs to me that it couldn't be a better tie-in with Mike's topic here. I mean, if we've got students on campus who are trying to figure out how to get their, Gonzaga to stop investing in fossil fuels in our endowment, and are trying to figure out what strategy would work, what tactic is the right one to persuade our trustees to do that. So if you're a student and want to sort of be inspired by Mike Peterson's life, I mean, that would be a way to sort of get involved on campus, because we're looking for students to do that. So whether you're a citizen in town and you want to figure out how to get involved, or make sure you're on the Lands Council's list for sure. 350 Spokane, and if you're a student, Gonzaga Environmental Organization, GEO, does amazing work, Office of Sustainability, and then Fossil Free Gonzaga, the investment club, is also another really good vehicle for walking the walk, as one of our speakers or audience mentioned. We may have time for maybe 2 more questions if there are any. Questions?
Like any other inspiring literature besides all students would probably read Desert Solitaire, Ed Abbey, any other inspiring things to make people comprehend?
Well, yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. Monkey wrenching is the idea of doing something to put a wrench in the machine, literally. And sometimes that means literally put a wrench in a logging machine. Sometimes that means, these days, putting out some fake news. You could have called the recycling party monkey wrenching in a way. It was just trying to do something different, but putting a positive spin and thanking. I mean, it'd be fun to thank whatever the corporation is that we want to change their behavior, and thank them, so that actually they get all these people thanking them, and then it guilts them into doing it. So as far as books, you need to name more than I do. I don't have time to read. But there's a lot of great authors out there, but I would start with certainly Edward Abbey. He's just inspiring, and I love the desert, so I love to get down there and see what's worth saving down there.
Well, there's some literature outside by the Lands Council. I really appreciate you coming to the latest Environmental Studies Department's lecture series. Stay tuned for subsequent lectures, and be safe on the road.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and be sure to join or donate if you can have any spare change.